Hello and good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Helen Soswalski of Oblong Books in New York's Hudson Valley. We've got a big crowd tonight for Peter Blauner and David Duchovny, and we're going to just let people pile into the event, and they're coming in thick and fast at the moment. We're featuring author Peter Blauner and his new novel, Picture in the Sand, and he's in conversation tonight with David Duchovny, who also has a novella. Current novella is called The Reservoir. He also has a new graphic novel, Kepler, which he co-authored with illustrator Richard Sevy. And before I go into the Q&A details, we'll just wait for a few more people to roll in. All right. Okay, well, we're going to kick that off. If you've not already ordered a copy of Picture in the Sand, you can do so on our website, which is oblongbooks.com, where you'll also find copies of David Duchovny's novella and the new graphic novel I was just mentioning, Kepler. There will be a Q&A time to ask your questions at the end of the conversation. You can leave those questions in the chat, or you can leave them in the Q&A module, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. So let's just see. Okay. And I'm going to introduce our guest this evening. Peter Blauner is an Edgar-winning New York Times bestselling author of several novels, including Slow Motion Riot, The Intruder, and Sunrise Highway. His books have been translated into 20 languages. Picture in the Sand is the culmination of 2 decades of writing and research that took him from Brooklyn to Cairo at least a half a dozen times. It's a sweeping intergenerational saga told through a grandfather's passionate letters to his grandson, passing on the story of his political rebellion in 1950s Egypt in order to save his grandson's life in a post-9/11 world. The author Stephen King says of Picture in the Sand, "On rare occasions, I read a book that reminds me of why I fell in love with storytelling in the first place. And this is such a book." Good praise indeed. David Duchovny, as I'm sure you all know, is an American actor, writer, producer, director, novelist, and singer-songwriter. He's best known for playing FBI Agent Fox Mulder on the television series The X-Files and Hank Moody on the television series Californication, both of which have earned him Golden Globe Awards. A keen poet and writer, David was nominated for a college prize by the Academy of American Poets for his outstanding work within the literary field. In 1987, he abandoned his doctoral studies at Yale to pursue acting full-time. He is the author of the novels Truly Like Lightening, Bucky F, Dent, and Holy Cow. And as I mentioned earlier, most recently, the novella Reservoir, and co-author with illustrator Phillip Sevy of the graphic novel Kepler. Welcome to you both. It's an absolute pleasure to have you join us this evening. Could you start us off by both telling us a little bit about your book?
Sure, and I'm glad you used the word abandoned my studies. That's exactly how my mom would have thought about it. The Reservoir, the novella, is it kind of came about literally from my view out the window in Central Park West, where I was living at the time, and actually taking these time-lapse photos of the reservoir. And it was during the COVID lockdown. And I was just kind of amusing myself with these very much the same, but very different time-lapse photos of the reservoir and the beauty of it and in the silence of New York at the time. And then it just came to me kind of as a mashup of Death in Venice and Rear Window, that kind of imagine one of these Wall Street veterans who fancies himself an artist, having retired with a bunch of money, and now he's going to pursue his art, and these time-lapse photos are going to be his art, and through taking these photos, he kind of gets involved with what he sees as a damsel in distress across the way, and it turns into kind of a Rear Window COVID fever dream, and into all the mysteries of what's gone on in New York and what's gone on in America, and all the conspiratorial thinking that we're kind of reckoning with right now. So that's kind of the inspiration and the execution of it. I see that I'm frozen. I hope to unfreeze at some point. However, I have no control over these matters.
I look forward to you being unfrozen in the near future as well. My book, it comes from a different kind of personal experience. As much as I have a religious upbringing, the Ten Commandments, the film by Cecil B. DeMille, is part of that. It runs every Passover, Easter weekend, and I usually only catch at the end of the movie with the famous parting of the Red Sea sequence. But on the first Passover, Easter after 9/11, everybody had a hard time settling down for the meal, and I saw it for the first time from the beginning. And the credits rolled Charlton Heston, Yul Brynner, and Baxter. And as the Pharaoh's army, it said the Egyptian Cavalry Corps. And I realized that this movie was partly shot in Egypt, and it was shot in Egypt at a time that was crucial to the formation of the violent ideology that led to 9/11. And I knew just from my background, from being a journalist, that Cecil B. DeMille had been in the country at the exact time that the extremist wing of the Muslim Brotherhood was battling with the new military leader of Egypt to turn the country into a theocracy. And I said, if I don't know how to turn this into a novel, I'm in the wrong business. It only took me 20 years to figure out the right way to tell the story, which was to make it into an epistolary novel, in a sense, of a young man who in 1954 in Egypt is a fanatical movie lover who gets his dream job working for Cecil B. DeMille, thinks he's going to come to America, change his name from Ali Hassan to Al Harrison, move to Pasadena, get a Plymouth, and get the American dream. It doesn't work out like that. It turns into a journey of love and loss that takes him from the glamour of the movie set to a real-life assassination plot that changed the course of history, to prison, and finally a version of his dream. And he tells the story as an old man in the present day to his grandson, who's about to run off and make the exact same mistakes by joining a holy war instead of going to an Ivy League college as his parents intend. And so the novel goes back and forth from Ali telling his story in 1954 to the grandson reading the story and commenting on it through the narrative of the book.
Peter, I think we should let everyone know that we went to high school together at this point.
That's right.
And I've been reading Peter's writing since 1974. And so therefore I feel qualified to say, and this is no slight against what you've done before, but I felt when you sent me this novel that this was your masterpiece, was a masterpiece. And I was just so proud is the wrong word, because it feels condescending in that sense, but I was so happy to see how you had used the style that you had developed, which was very not repertorial, but very much, and not even procedural, but you're living in both those worlds. You have lived in both those worlds as a person and as a writer. You write for television as well. You've written for procedural. So I was just so impressed by the alchemy that you were able to pull on what you're describing as your historical inspiration for it. You said, if I can't turn this into a novel, I'm in the wrong business. Now,
Right.
You're being humble there, because it's no easy feat what you've done. And I guess my question would be a two-part question, or something to talk about. I mean, obviously my thing is of the moment, and it took no research, and I'm very much attracted to things that have no research, to be honest with you. And that's not to say it's at all autobiographical either. That's the trap that you can also fall into. But took you 20 years to write this novel. This novel you raised your kids while you were thinking of this. You lived the whole.
One of my kids said when I sold it, this book is like my brother. It's been
Right. So
third child. Yeah.
that is an incredible thing to think about. I don't know what it means for the writing of it or the writing in it, but it is something to think about and something to talk about, just in terms of the profundity of the longevity of this idea and this undertaking as you were living the best years of your life. Not you still have many to go, but this was the raising of children, and if there's anything to talk about there. And also what I was drawn to, just as a friend and a reader, was the amount of research that went into it was immense, obviously. And my kind of area that I'd love to talk to you about that is, because I don't love to do research. I love to have research done. I mean, we all farm it out a bit, and the internet has made this kind of thing much easier. But sometimes there's a sense in which facts will weigh down and sink a narrative, and you have to be able to choose the salient facts that make it rise. And not, everybody always points to that chapter in Moby Dick where he's talking about what you do with the whale, and nobody likes that chapter. It's like, and I'm not sure that they're right, but it's this relationship between facts and the bare fact that what you've written is really a deification of storytelling, which is not facts at all. And there's a certain amount of Scheherazade in it, just keep the kid talking. And also I was put in mind of like cop speak, just keep the kid talking. Keep him talking. And I was really moved by how you brought everything that you've been doing as a professional writer for more than 20 years, but obviously 20 years, all these strands that, whether consciously or unconsciously, you brought to bear on both the style and the substance of this novel.
Right. I mean, in a way, it's not that different, because you want the research to disappear. You want it to feel like it's just second nature that the character is talking that way. And basically, you want the book to feel lived in rather than dictated out of somebody's notebook. And in a way, that's what took the 20 years to make that notebook disappear, and to make the illusion that the character is just before you telling the story in a natural way. And that was the trick. And also to make the decision of like, well, I did all this research and these facts are really interesting, that Cecil B. DeMille at one point wanted the guy who played Hopalong Cassidy to play Moses.
Right.
But that's not going to move the story forward in some way. So you got to be willing to kill your darlings. In that way. But the other thing that I think is in common is that, for me at least, and I think it may be true for you, without being autobiographical, every book is kind of a picture of where you are at that point in your life.
Well, this is what I want to bring up.
Yeah.
You can't take a picture of 20 years.
Yeah.
There is a certain amount. I work quickly off of inspiration. Sometimes I go back to something and finish it, but usually I work hard and fast and get through. Henry James William James in his introductions had said, rereading these stories, it's like walking in somebody else's footprints in the snow. It's not even as if he wrote them. And I'm just wondering what the mindset was as year after year, you're a different person.
Yeah.
Not revolutionarily, but somewhat. And you're trying to walk in these footprints that you've started on this journey. To me, it's another book in and of itself. The book behind this book, as where you said, it's a snapshot. So how does it represent a snapshot of 20 years?
Because it's a record of those 20 years in a sense, because it's a dialogue between the past and the present, a dialogue between the young man and the old man. And when I started the book, I was closer to being the young man's age, frankly. And now I'm not quite the old man's age, but I'm closer to that at that point. And that's the journey. That's the journey that I didn't think it would be 20 years, but that's the journey I signed on for.
Do you chalk that up to the brilliance or the genius of the inspiration to say, okay, I'm going to frame it this way? There's no way you knew at that point that you were going to change from the younger man to the older man as you wrote it, but it speaks to the kind of intelligence of your choice in that way, and the correctness of your choice.
Or the obstinance of running the same Ford Pinto into the same brick wall over and over and over again until I blasted a hole in the wall and crawled through on my hands and knees.
Do you have a specific instance of that? Was there a sticking point that you were banging your head against over and over again within either the plot or a character or a notion, or is that just
it was, why should people today care about what happened in 1954 Egypt? All this research, and we've both seen a lot of shows and read a lot of books that are like, well, that's a very interesting idea, but I don't feel any emotional pull to that. I needed to answer that question. And the answer for me was ultimately the old man telling this cautionary tale to the young man. But I didn't have that answer until the pandemic. Like, usually I do a lot of firsthand research with my books. Like for the first book I wrote, Slow Motion Riot, is about a probation officer. And so I went and I was a probation officer for 6 months, so I would have the experience. I couldn't do that kind of firsthand research during the pandemic. Like your character, Ridley, in the Reservoir, was, stuck in the house. So then I turned back to Picture in the Sand, which, had been around for a long time, and I'd worked out a lot of other parts of the story. And that's where I got the idea of like, well, who's telling this story? Who needs to hear this story? And that's how it became the old man talking to the young man.
So the old man didn't exist until yeah. Well, that's
for 18 years, the old man didn't exist. Though the image was in the back of my mind that this feels like a story that an old man should be telling, because you think about the 10 Commandments, you think about Moses standing on top of the mountain and telling the story. And then within the story, Cecil B. DeMille was standing on top of the gates of Per Ramses directing 15,000 people when he had a heart attack and somehow kept himself upright long enough to actually finish the picture. And that both those images were very moving to me. And I felt that I needed to persist in the same way. But again, both books sort of came together, both yours and mine, during the pandemic. And it was interesting reading The Reservoir, because I'd been saying to people ahead of time, I don't think any good books are going to come out of the pandemic, because I thought people are not going to want to be reminded of this period in any way. And I stand corrected.
Well, for me, I guess the inspiration, but it's amazing to hear that your breakthrough came that recently. That I mean, when one thinks of you working on this novel for 20 years, one thinks of you working on this particular novel for 20 years. But in fact, this particular novel didn't really exist in its form until a few years ago. Right. And when you talk about taking that long to write a book, well, that is the amazing thing. There's just so much convergence going on there. But for me, in the Reservoir, I never really, I think like you, I trust there's a story there. I mean, if there's anything that I trust as an artist, whether that's acting or writing or directing, the only thing I trust is that I can ID a story. Like if you tell me something, I can think that's a story. And I feel like my gut is good. So that's all I ever start with, is like, there's something here. And I don't really know what it is. Now the Reservoir is a slim thing. It's a novella. So it didn't take long, to get there. But I think that's what we share, I think, and we can even talk about, where we both learned, certain aspects of writing, because I think, without being a shill for a wonderful school, it was really a writing school, and we were both taught in high school. We wrote in all classes, not just English class, and I really do feel that I think differently with a pen in my hand, and I learned that. There. I'm a better thinker when I'm writing. I often think, why can't I speak the way I write? That would be really wonderful. I could be William F. Buckley, for God's sakes, and that we learned together, side by side sometimes.
And it was the best of both worlds in some ways, because the education was both inside the school and outside the school, because the New York City of the 1970s was a very different place than it is now. And there was much more of a sense of possibility in both the good sense, in terms of social mobility, and also in the sense, well, we're getting back to this, of danger. We right across the street from the Hotel Belclair, which was a halfway house SRO at the time. And it was just normal for us to pass the Phantom and the Birdman on the street every day, and people without pants on, and usually, you have to go into a locker room to see that. But you know what I mean? That we had both that sense of wild adventure outside the doors, and then once we went inside the doors, we were given the means to process that, and that was a real privilege. And not only the writing, but also the reading that we were exposed to at that time. And I hope that shows up in, all our books.
I think it does. I think, without just giving all the credit to the school, which is called collegiate, by the way, I think I give credit to just the act of writing and the act of teaching writing and the act of holding writing in a high place in modes of thought, and I fear that we're getting away from a world that holds it in that kind of esteem, or that it has importance anymore. But that's probably a discussion for another time or another place.
Well, I have a question for you. Do you think, and we both have in common experience working in television, to what extent do the novels, and I'm talking about your novels as well as my own, are they written in a style that's a reaction to working in television? Do you think that's there at all?
Well, it's a good question. I would also bring movies into it, not just television.
Yeah, sure.
And my answer changes in the last 4 or 5 years, because a couple of my novels have started as screenplays that I wasn't able to get off the ground, and I turned them into novels because I just wanted to tell a story. I wanted to get the story out there. I also wanted to see what the story was, because usually I don't have it all. You don't have it. One doesn't have it. If one has it, when one is running out of the gate, it's probably not going to work. You want to be surprised along the way.
You can't do with the television script, by the way, because like if you decide, it's going to be a bowling alley, not St. Patrick's Cathedral on day 7, you're going to have a lot of people angry at you. Right.
So
anyway,
yes, there's that for sure. But what I would always bemoan was I couldn't list on 5 fingers the great movies that were made out of great novels. Usually it was pulpy novels that made great movies. Instant plot, action, that translates. What books do well, which is interior thought.
That's where I was going.
Nearly impossible without the crutch of a voiceover to do in film or television. But with the advent of the past 6-7 years of streamers and the 8-hour story, the 10-hour story, I feel like we are kind of in a golden age of being able to make great television or great movie type television out of great novels. Whereas in the past, 2 hours is not enough. Still, you can't do interiorization like you can do in a novel. But if you have 8
Thank God we
like,
still got something that they can't do on the screen. That's what
yeah,
I was going with it, because it seems to me that one of the common threads in your books, and it really reaches its fruition in the Reservoir, is that it is about the voice, and it is about being inside that guy's head. And one of the wonderful things about novels is that it can be this transmission from the studio inside your head to the theater inside the reader's head. And, you know, thank God, I think, that no one can figure out how to do that in television. I mean, they can tell more, you know, kind of interior stories in some ways, but it's not quite the same thing yet.
Well, you know, it's very interesting, because I do know that, you know, when you look at the advent of new technologies throughout the history of our species, the novel, which is a new technology, or the printed word first is a new technology. I've heard the printed word referred to as the first computer, right? It's the first time we stored information outside of our brains. Before that, we would be an oral tradition, and what you could know would be limited by what you could remember and pass on. So this computer was made, this piece of paper with words on it. And then the novel comes, I don't know how many hundreds of years later. And there was as much consternation about the novel being the downfall of civilization as there was about television when you and I were growing up, and there is about phones as kids are growing up now. So it's very interesting to me that you and I would sit here and say the savior is the novel.
Yeah.
Whereas when the novel was coming to age in the 19th century, people were saying that's it, because it's not focused on heroes, it's focused on regular people, people of dubious morals. You know, it's not epic poetry. It's the art form of the masses, of the regular person. So it's fascinating to me to think along those lines, because I will look at the phone and I'm saying that's it, it's over. I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, maybe it's just of our generation. Well, the other thing that people say about novels now is, oh, okay, how can you write from somebody's point of view that's not your group in some way? And you know, how can you speak for anybody else? How can you be presumed to be a character who's not you, who you don't? I guess that comes up these days with acting as well. And to me, that's, and I understand that point of view to some extent, you know, that if you feel like, okay, my group hasn't gotten to be in bookstores, and why do you get to tell my story? I get that in some way, but also I can feel like that's one of the wonderful things about writing and acting, that you can make that imaginative transport from your experience to somebody else, that Lin-Manuel Miranda can imagine, you know, being Alexander Hamilton, or that, you know, of course,
the word is the word of the decade that we all want is empathy. That's exactly what it is.
Right.
And I think what's confusing, I don't want to say that people get confused, but I think the way it's interpreted can be interpreted. You always have to be very careful, is that you have written this book that takes the point of view of two men of Egyptian extraction.
Yeah.
You are not saying that you speak for all Egyptians. You are not saying that you supersede any Egyptian voice. You are not even saying it's too bad there aren't more Egyptian authored books in the bookstore. You are merely saying this is a story that caught my eye and that I'm telling it. It's sometimes I feel like when you tell a story, that story becomes a campaign, but it's not. It's just one story that you were telling, and you needed to go to this place in order to tell it.
Well, that was the point of view of the story that made the story real and grounded for me. I wanted to tell a story about this moment where the Ten Commandments was being filmed. The story of Moses was being filmed in the place where allegedly it took place. And I did try and tell it from an American character's point of view. I did try and tell it briefly from, one of the famous people's point of view. And I thought, I don't really identify with that. That's not bringing it alive. And I remembered something that Jimmy Breslin, the New York newspaper columnist, said. He said, look for the grave digger. And what he meant by that was he had written a column after John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And everybody else was writing about the grassy knoll and the book depository and the kind of rifle and all that. And he went to the cemetery and he found the guy who was actually digging the grave. And he wrote a wonderful column about that guy. And it made the truth of the story come alive in a brand new way. And that's what I needed to do.
That's a great story, because one of the things that I was thinking about when I was reading her novel was Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead.
There you go. Yeah, exactly.
Because you've taken a story that has all these famous people and has all these touchstones that we can all, that are shiny,
right?
And you have said, and I think that this would be, if there was any program that you're adhering to, it's that the gravediggers, the Rosencrantz and the Guildenstern, their stories deserve to be told. That it's actually, your inclusivity is radical in that sense. Just as,
and most of us are more like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern than we are like the king, or like the gravedigger than we are like JFK. Just trying to find a human way to tell the story.
Don't know where else to go from the gravedigger. He's kind of dug our graves.
Well, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Do you think there is such a thing as a David Duchovny novel?
I mean, there's 5 of them.
Okay, there's 5 of them.
No, because I work, as I said, I work from story. I don't work from a theme. I don't work from, and I'm interested in many things, I think. So, I went from a fable, and I think your novel has fabulistic. What I do like very much about your novel is that it can hold both procedural and fable at the same time, which is not easy.
I think the fable thing is in a bunch of your books.
Yes.
And it comes up. And I'd include Bucky Dent. I'd include Bucky Dent, because the Bambino is as much of a fable that forms that book as, sort of the fables that underpin Miss Subway and fables that underpin the Reservoir, and that sort of this relationship between myth and reality.
Well, if you go, if you expand fable to also include, what's come before, in literature and myth, then I guess you asked me what's a book that's me, or is there a David Duchovny book? It would be one that engages in conversation with myths and fables that came before and tries to tell stories for our time that are resonant in that way. I guess I always responded or became alive when I felt spoken to by ancient myths, and I wanted to be able to. When I started writing, I wanted to be able to write in that template. Obviously, not that template doesn't exist anymore, but you can do it in a way in fiction where you're kind of working both in the real world and in a mythic world.
Well, that was the appeal of the Ten Commandments story as well. That the Moses, it is a myth. I mean, because there's no historic, basis that has been uncovered up to now. There are people who think that it's actually based on an Egyptian pharaoh named Akhenaten. But anyway, it was the same idea that there's this myth that is central to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as a matter of fact. And then sort of there's this movie version of it that we all know, and it has different meanings in people's everyday lives. So I think that is something that's in common between all those books, and that, you know, we do have sort of this common element, this common consciousness between us.
Well, I think we're looking for stories that mean something, you know, to us and even as a world culture, you know, the stories that resonate across the board, you know, and if you're looking at like the Marvel universe, like I do, it's not resonating with me in that way.
No.
So I'm looking elsewhere, you know, but I don't give up, you know, in thinking, oh, you can write a story that reaches a lot of people on a very fundamental human level, aside from its plot, aside from whatever superficial overpinnings it has. And I do feel, because of the fabulistic understructure of your book, what I'd say the Scheherazade slash interrogating cop aspect of it. That's why, for me, that I feel like that's why all those facts that we began this conversation talking about that could weigh down a story don't, because there's this, fables are light.
Right.
You know, fables go back to, you know, the dawn of our knowledge. You know, I loved Aesop's fables when I was a kid. I loved an allegory. I loved all that. And you were able to, in your book, have enough specificity that the allegory is deep enough so that one doesn't get condescended to at all, you know, and that the deep knowledge of your book, which I think is humanistic and not historic.
Well, that's why it was important to put it in the dialogue between the grandson and the grandfather, in a way, so that the grandson, you know, so they can be talking about it just in a more casual way.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I just think you did such a beautiful job, and I hope people find it, Peter. I really do.
Thank you, David. I do appreciate it.
Yeah. You want to open it up to Q&A?
I was about to ask that.
Yeah, we've got a bunch of questions here. Let's start asking some of them. Okay, our first question is for Peter, and it's from Melanie. If you had to write a sequel to one of your novels, which one would it be?
Oh, in a way, it would be Slow Motion Riot, which was the very first one that was written in 1988, at a moment in New York City when we were overwhelmed by crack and AIDS and hopelessness. And yet the city persists in its way. And it was about the limit of good intentions and people trying to hold on to the best part of themselves in spite of overwhelming odds. And I'm always interested to see how that story turns out later in life, how the young man becomes the older man. So yeah, I might come back to those guys.
Thanks. And also from Melanie for David, I've devoured all of your books, but I'm a greedy reader. Are you working on another novel?
I'm not, but I bemoan the fact that I'm not almost daily. I have a couple of ideas that I'm tossing around, but you know, right now they're just they're auditioning in my mind for, you know, who gets my attention. I just wrote a little short story that's going to be actually appended to the paperback version of the Reservoir, which is actually a fable, to be honest with you. So that's something I just finished.
By the way, there was a Reservoir episode in Miss Subway. It was a really good piece of writing. Did the novella grow out of that episode? That's the kind of geriatric sex orgy in the Reservoir you're speaking. No.
But spoiler alert,
Cocoon in the Reservoir. No, but like you, Peter. Even though I'm an expatriate from New York City, it's in me so deeply that I find myself not only writing about where its streets physically and its park, but in the Reservoir, I kind of, when you go under the reservoir, that's where you come face to face with all these tragedies and crimes and that have happened in New York and by New Yorkers and things like that. And there's something, you use the word, the resilience of it. There's something about New York that persists beyond all this horrible history from time to time. So I think both of us, being native New Yorkers, I think we're trapped in this kind of love affair with that city as artists.
Yeah.
Thanks. From Joanne. Peter, one of the friends to whom I lent my copy of Picture in the Sand loved it, but said she wished, don't worry, I won't spoil anything, it had ended with the opposite possible outcome. At what point in the writing process do you decide how your story will end?
David, I'd be interested in your point of view. You touched on this earlier. I often will write out an outline for the book, and then I will do the card on the corkboard method that we use to plot out television episodes. And if I follow that outline, and if I follow the cards on the corkboard completely, I have failed, because that means that the characters have not developed any kind of independent life on their own. So I only know what's going to happen on the last page when I get there. And when I figure out what happened on the last page, then it's time to go back to the first page and rewrite that, because it's only then that I know what the story is about.
Well, that's a very interesting way to put it, because with Truly Like Lightning, which is the longest novel that I've written and maybe read, but the longest that I've written,
Forced to, yeah,
and one in which I probably had at least the least plotted out. And I too have done the note cards because I've been in television writing as well. There's a moment in which in whatever novel that I've written where the characters start to speak to me independently. You said independence, yeah, and I think that's the way to talk about it. And it's close to insanity, and it's close to acting. It's close to creating.
Well, that's interesting. I was literally going to ask you what's the Venn diagram?
Yeah.
What's inside the Venn diagram and what's outside of it?
Well, well, what you said earlier, voice. Yeah. What's the voice? And they used to say Dickens he sounded like a crazy person in his room when he was reading, because he was reciting, he was speaking to himself as he was speaking all the voices, all the characters. And I feel like language is often character. And that's not something I learned as an actor, but something I learned as a writer. And there is a moment in which, if you're lucky, a character will say, nope, I don't want to do that. Fuck you. Put me over here. This is where I want to be. And you'll go, and if you're a good writer or an adventurous writer, you'll go, that's stupid, but let's see what happens over there. And that's the magic of it. And that happens in acting as well. When you let go of the words and you let go of all the research that you've done, all the homework that you've done, something happens if you're lucky. Yeah. And that's a good performance.
Yeah.
I've heard a lot of authors talk about the voice taking over or having a mind of their own. There's a question here from David Becker to both of you. Did you have beers at the Dublin house as teenagers, the Irish bar around the corner from Collegiate? And did it inspire your writing?
May have delayed my writing in my day.
The Shelter was The Shelter.
Yeah, The Shelter, that's going back a ways. Yeah.
Yeah. There are
Thought you'd
ghosts.
get-
There are ghosts of
House is
ours as well as people in the world.
Thought you'd get a kick out of that one. From Wendy in Scotland, David, the process of writing a graphic novel seems very different from that of an ordinary novel. What was your experience, and did you have to adapt your style of writing at all?
Absolutely. A graphic novel is very much like storyboards, almost exactly like storyboards, I would say, which is why graphic novels are easily adapted into films, or easily sold into being adapted in films, because it's right there. It's like seeing an entire movie storyboard in front of you. Because of that, there's really no description necessary. It's more like a poem, I would say, where and I've often thought that screenplay writing or graphic novel writing is more like poetry than it is prose, because you're firing out image after image, and those images are creating a montage that then reflect back upon each other, and you make sense through the images and not the words. So the words are very much became secondary in Kepler. Obviously, there's dialogue, though, but even the dialogue, I like to luxuriate in dialogue when I'm writing a novel, because you can't. You don't have to, you don't have to cut so much as you would in a screenplay or a movie script. But in a graphic novel, you really have to be concise, and it's tough. It was tough for me that way, because I think I fell in love with novel writing this late in the game, and coming to it as an actor was because I had no time limit on the words. I was not that I fatuously want to make an 800-page novel and bore everybody, but it felt really liberating to not have someone looking over my shoulder and saying, "Hey, it's the middle of the second act. You better start making the turn towards, the end of the movie here."
That's interesting. Thank you. For Peter from Elisha or Cindy, I think two people have asked this question. What was the research process in Egypt like? What did your process look like?
Well, there was quite a long research process. I also want to just note, I saw somebody flash across the screen. No, you named the wrong pharaoh. Ramses II is commonly thought of as the role model for the pharaoh in the Exodus story. I was referring to Akhenaten as the monotheist pharaoh, that there was one god. That sort of background from Sigmund Freud's Moses and Monotheism book, which is one of the hundreds of books that I read for this. The other thing that happened with the research for this book is right at the very beginning. I normally don't tell people what I'm writing about, but I happened to be at a wedding with some relatives, and I said, I'm going to do this crazy thing about Cecil B. DeMille's 10 Commandments in Egypt. And one of my in-laws said, "Oh, I know his grandchildren." I was like, "You're kidding me." They said, "No." So I was able to meet Cecil B. DeMille's grandchildren, Cecilia and Joe, who were actually there in Egypt at the time that the movie was being made.
Wow.
And they're actually not that old. Cecilia was 17 at the time, and Joe was 11. And so they shared a lot of their firsthand memories and adventures, things that happened to them, some of which are actually in the book. I also met as many people as I could who were involved with Gamal Abdel Nasser's government, and also who were involved in the Egyptian movie industry at the time. And I even met the brother of the guy who founded the Muslim Brotherhood. And I approached it in that stage, at least as a reporter, I just got out there and interviewed hundreds of people. And then as David and I were talking about, then there's the process of making all that disappear. And then I eventually finished the book, and it was only a couple of months ago that I sent the finished book to Cecilia, DeMille's granddaughter, with some apprehension, because, I'm talking about part of her life as well in this book. And she wrote back to me, and she said, "You were pretty tough on the old man," which I am in the book. But she said, "I really loved the book." That was really meaningful to me, to close that circle.
That's wonderful. And that kind of leads to, I won't read the whole question, but Joanne Gruber also asked about those personalities, Nasser and Cecil B. DeMille and Charlton Heston, and about your research versus your invention. And I think you've just answered that question for her. Charmian asked the question, do you guys send each other your completed work or works in progress all the time? And do you discuss work with each other, or do you just read it when it's finished?
I feel like I read this twice. I feel like you sent it to me a few years ago. I know you've been talking, obviously been writing.
I talked about it so much that you felt like you're at it. I actually talked to you about it like back in 2002. I think right when I had the idea. And okay, well, I'll look forward to it when it comes out. But no, I read David's books when they come out. Yeah,
likewise. I don't know that I'm a good early reader for anyone. I don't know that many writers that are. It's not necessarily the same skill. And also, you're talking about, we're talking about Peter writing this over 20 years. It's also, you have to be very, very protective of your work when you're doing it, because if Peter had sent this to me 10 years ago, I and asked me for what I thought, what I say could be really destructive, just like trying to say, have a thought. Maybe I don't have a thought, but I've got to have a thought. So it's really tough. You have to choose your readers, your early readers, really wisely. And I think Peter is wise in not having me as one of his early readers.
No, I think that your point is very well taken generally, to be very sensitive and attuned and protective of your own work, that sometimes people, even with the best of intentions, can trample on the one piece that's actually going to work 5 years from now and may not be prominent at this point, if that makes any sense. So you really have to protect your dream to some extent.
We have a couple more questions here. Pamela asks both of you, how does writing novels influence your television script? Do the two disciplines intermingle? And how do they influence? How does your writing fiction influence your writing for television?
Well, I'll say this, and I've said it before, and I don't know. I don't think I speak for Peter when I say this, because he has taken such a different track from me after high school in terms of his writing career. I went to graduate school for English literature, and there, plot is the redheaded stepchild. Nobody talks about what happens. You talk more about what doesn't happen in graduate school. You talk about the blindness of the author to his own creation. You talk about structuralism. You talk about deconstruction. All these very, very specified fields of critique. And that's where I was coming from when I went back into television as an actor. And let's say it's the X-Files. It's about plot. And after a couple of years doing that and being asked by Chris Carter to start to write for the show as well, I fell in love with plot again. I fell in love with procedure, and I think Peter's been there all along, but it didn't necessarily have to happen that way. I would say that being in television, not necessarily writing for television, but being in it as an actor, saved me as a writer in the end.
That's an interesting, great answer. What about you, Peter?
It's the shows I've written for are so different from the books that I kind of write in with a consciousness of, I don't want to give people something that they could just get from watching a television show. I want to give them voice. I want to give them a different kind of character. I want to give them texture. I want to give them a different experience, when they open a book than they could have when they, turn on their television set. So I just considered them to be very different realms.
Right. We have, I think we have time for one last question here, and that is from John. Speaking of movies, Peter, is there any formal movement for Pictures in the Sand for itself to be a motion picture? And a little one for David. You said you think better with a pen in your hand. You literally write longhand. Peter, let's answer the motion picture question first.
Well, actually, I write longhand, I was going to say, because I want to avoid being on the internet, because I write very, very slowly, that it forces me to really be inside a sentence in a way that, like being at the keyboard, allows me to glide over the surface of, which I don't want to do when I'm writing novels at all. I don't know if that's David's experience at all. I mean, there's some discussion of Picture in the Sand as a movie. It's expensive. You know, people kind of, quail at the idea of period pictures these days. It would be great if it happens. I'm just thrilled the thing is between two covers.
Yeah, well, I would second that. I mean, I think it's a movie, but it's a big movie. So, or it's 8 hours,
Yep.
or it's 8 hours.
Television show. Yeah, absolutely.
No, I don't. I misrepresented myself.
But it sounded cool.
Yeah, I know. And also I had a pen while I said it.
Yeah.
I do.
That's acting.
I write with a pad and a pen nearby, but I write on a computer. But I don't, and this will align with Peter a little better. I'm not a touch typist. I'm a hunt and peck typist on a computer. That's how I write like this, and that slows me down. But if I get too slowed down, that's why I have the pad here. I'll if I get ahead of myself and I have thoughts about 3 chapters from now, that's why the pad and the pen are here, and I'll make little notes over here on the side, and then I'll go back to this. Very exciting stuff.
It is. It's interesting to hear about everybody's processes. There are so many similarities, and yet everybody's process is slightly different.
Yeah.
Well, I have to thank you both for an absolutely wonderful discussion this evening, and congratulations to you on your book. Peter, Picture in the Sand, a reminder, you can buy copies of Picture in the Sand at oblongsbooks.com. I did post the links in the chat. I'll post them again before we leave. David, thank you so much for jumping in and joining us. It was a pleasure to have you with us. And David Naval.
I should publicly, I'm going to publicly right now forgive Peter for, I can't imagine why, but putting Stephen King's blurb in front of mine on his book. I can't imagine why would want to put Stephen King in front of mine, but I publicly forgive you. I know it was a very tough decision to try to figure out who should go first, and I kind of get it. So I still love you.
Thank you.
If it's any consolation, David, your blurb was sort of highlighted in a graphic on the webpage for this event. Stephen's was just a sentence. So thank you both so much. Please go out and buy the books. Thanks to everybody who joined us from all over the world. It was amazing to see how many people came from. You must be really late in half of these places, but we really appreciate it. Peter, David, thank you so much. Good night, everyone. Have a good rest of your evening.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.